Hello, I am Pastor Ari Matson. I am the pastor of Martin Luther Lutheran Church in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is part of the ELCA. And this is the fourth session in my Bible study on the biblical case for LGBTQ inclusion. In this session, I'm going to start to look more at so-called clobber verses, the verses that have traditionally been used for exclusion of people from sexual minorities. So, as we do that, first, I just wanted to start with looking at a little bit of what do we mean by sin? And I touched on this a little bit in the previous session, but to get into it a little more depth here. So first, the Bible talks about sin, and I'm going to use a big S there, more often than it talks about sins. And when I use those two like that, I'm meaning sin as the state of imperfection, of brokenness, separation from God. It's what we are. Because we are rebellious humans that do not have a proper relationship with God, we exist within a state of sin, or you might say of original sin. Sins, with a little s, are the things that we do that hurt God or they hurt others. They're the things that we do. So big S sin is what we are, and small s sins are what we do. And they are, small s sins are things that hurt God or they hurt other people. They damage relationships, they cause harm within the world. So, and as those relate to LGBTQ questions, certainly we would say that big S sin is something that we all are. All of us are in need of healing and hope. Small s sins are things that that all of us do at some point, right? That we can lie, we can steal, we can hurt people, we can do things that are damaging or dishonest. If homosexuality fits into the category of sin, it's going to be in that second one, into the small s sins. Thing that we do that hurts God or hurts others. And if that's the case, then I think we need to ask, how does being homosexual, how does having a non-binary or non-traditional gender identity hurt people? How does it hurt God? And I think from my perspective, it doesn't do anything to damage relationship. It doesn't do anything to physically hurt people. I know it can make some people uncomfortable, but that's not the same as hurting someone. And as we mentioned in the previous one, if God creates us and our sexuality, our sexual orientation, our gender identity is a part of what we are created as, then would God create us as something that automatically hurts God and who God is? I think that's a difficult thing to try to square. Matthew 22, I think this is a really important passage to come back to time and again. Jesus says the greatest commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. He says, on these two things hang all of the scriptures and the prophets. So loving God, loving neighbor. So instead of hurting, drawing us together, building community around God with one another, that is what God creates us and calls us to be and to do. And so I think it's an important question to consider as we're wrestling with the idea of sin. How would gender identity or sexuality influence one of those things? So, yeah, and I mentioned this here. My contention there at the bottom is that the sin is not loving homosexuality as we understand it today, that loving a loving and caring homosexual relationship, or a person who is loving and caring as a transgender or non-binary person, is not hurting God, is not hurting creation or other people in the way that sin does as we would understand it. I think it's also maybe important to quickly mention that, as I said, the Bible talks about big S sin a whole lot, and not as much about individual sins necessarily, but that we as humans tend to reverse that. We talk an awful lot about sins, the things we do, and not so much about being in a state of sin, being in a broken relationship that needs to be repaired. We tend to focus on what can I do instead of where I am and the need for grace within that. So when we start looking at texts that speak of homosexuality or gender identity within the Bible, it's really important to ask questions about culture and language. Because these scriptures were written thousands of years ago, written in very different contexts, to very different cultures, very different peoples with very different understandings of themselves, of the world, of how everything works. It's really important to ask those questions. What did they assume? What did they think they knew that was obvious to them that maybe we don't see as obvious, or we've learned beyond that? What did they mean by the words that they used? How maybe the meaning of the words have changed over time, or how did they change when being translated from another language into English? What did they know that we don't about themselves, about their culture, what's around them? And is this passage speaking to a specific problem in one time and place, or is it being shared as a universal thing, right? Certainly what to do with manna out in the wilderness, that is something related to a very specific time and place. We don't have manna anymore. That was related to a situation in which the Israelites found themselves in the wilderness. And so we don't need to worry about how properly to collect and store manna today in our modern world. So another really important thing to recognize is that our understanding of homosexuality, our understanding of gender identity, and are not the same as existed in the ancient world, though they were aware of homosexual practices and of non-typical, non-normative gender identities. They didn't really have almost all of them, if any of them had a concept of it being a natural orientation, that you were simply born as a gay person, that was who you were and how you're wired, and something that can happen naturally and happens in other species as well, as we've learned. Nor did they really have an idea that gender is a social construct. What we mean by masculine and feminine, male and female, vast majority of that is tied up in our cultural values and our social norms and values. And many parts of those things are not universal from one culture to the next, or from one era to the next. They're tied up in what we consider normal, or what we consider comfortable. And so that's one of the reasons that we really look at gender and say, well, what does it mean to have one gender or the other? So these are the important things for us to be reflecting on, considering as we're looking at this. We're going to start by just looking at Leviticus, because this is an important text for looking at this. There are two mentions within Leviticus about homosexual activity, and the word that gets used with them and elsewhere that often gets shared a lot is the word abomination. In Hebrew, the word is toeva. It appears 10 times in Leviticus, and it applies to a whole variety of issues. So sometimes it gets pointed to and lifted up, well, a man sleeping with a man is an abomination. The Bible says so. But like I said, it applies to several things. So eating sacrifices that are more than 2 days old, so sacrifices that have been brought to God that are more than 2 days old, those are an abomination. Eating raptor birds of prey, or bats, that's an abomination. A male lying with a male is with a woman. Sacrificing children to the god Moloch is an abomination. Bestiality is an abomination. Eating unclean animals like shrimp or shellfish, that is an abomination. So you'll notice there's really kind of a broad spectrum here. Certainly there are things that even today, sacrificing children, bestiality, yeah, those are immoral. Those are an abomination as we would understand it. Eating sacrifices after 2 days, does that really apply to us anymore? Is that relevant? Eating raptor birds or bats, I don't necessarily want to, but is that something that's morally evil? Or eating unclean animals. I love shrimp and shellfish. Am I an abomination or committing an abomination? So one of the things to recognize is that this word toiva, many Hebrew scholars will tell us, is probably not a moral judgment. This thing is evil, which is often the way that we use the word abomination, but instead is a ritual one. This thing makes you unclean. This thing is inappropriate. It's something that needs to be corrected or fixed. It is out of alignment of what God prefers or wants. And so therefore, even if something's an abomination, it doesn't mean that it is permanently evil, as much as this is something that should be avoided, but it isn't a permanent mark against you. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, that as we look at these passages as well. So what is condemned in the law of Moses? Most of what is forbidden falls into a few categories that we can find. And these are kind of my way of summarizing them, but I've seen similar lists in other places and heard other scholars talk about them. So most of what forbidden in the law of Moses that we find in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy falls into a few categories. One, things that get in the way of our relationship with God, right? Idolatry and worshiping of other gods, cursing God's name, not properly sacrificing or giving ourselves to God and trusting in God. Those are things that get in the way of our relationship with God. Things that get in the way of our relationship with our neighbor. Think of the 10 Commandments. Do not lie, do not steal, do not covet, do not commit adultery. These are things that break relationship with the people around us. Those are things that are often condemned. Practices of competing religions often make the list. So things that neighboring religions did, the people of who wrote the Torah seem to say, we want to put a really firm line here so that we don't accidentally adopt or begin worshiping other gods by doing things that are too similar to what they do. Even if the action itself maybe isn't awful or something that we think is terrible, we don't want to do it just because we don't want to accidentally appear as if we're worshiping another god or to slip into worship of another god. And I'll flip these last two. Limits of population growth. Growing the population was an important thing, especially for this nomadic tribe of people, the Israelites that are coming out of the wilderness and coming into a promised land. And they need to create a critical mass of people in order to be sustainable, in order to be able to defend themselves and continue on. So things that prevent pregnancy, things that waste semen, which is a big issue because they believe that semen held the entire human. They didn't understand our modern biology of X and Y chromosomes. Things that limited population growth would be condemned. And then blurring of clear categories. The writers of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, seem to be really interested in maintaining clear categories. They seem to have been really uncomfortable with things being too blurry. So, for instance, these include shellfish, mixing of crops, planting more than one thing in your field, incest, obviously mixing milk and flesh, right? Milk and beef in kosher cooking cannot go together. An example of how this works is maybe with shrimp or with shellfish. The Levitical law will say that a fish is something that has scales and fins. That's what a fish is. Fish is fine to eat. Shellfish, shrimp, we're not sure what to do with that. Lobster, because it has legs, and most things that have legs live on the land, but these things live in the water. They don't have fins or scales the way fish do. So we're not totally, it lives in the water, but it looks like a land animal. We're not totally sure where it fits. And so we're going to put that in the condemned category. We're going to put that over in this category of, we're just going to leave it alone. We're not sure where it belongs, but to be safe, we're just going to not touch it. right? And they seemed to do that a lot. When in doubt, put it out. When in doubt, just create this category of, we're just not even going to touch that. We're not going to go there because we're not certain. And so rather than accidentally offend God, we might say, we're just going to not touch it, right? And that's something that we see happening in the New Testament. We see Jesus condemning that at times. You're drawing these harsh lines and building these fences around these things that are hurting people more than they're helping people. But that seems to be something that these early people, the people writing the Torah, were really concerned about, is maintaining these clear categories, probably so we don't accidentally offend God, so we don't accidentally do something that does hurt God or neighbor without our knowing. So that's something that we see a lot of. So let's look at these specific texts. So chapter 18 says, you shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness while she is in her menstrual uncleanness. You shall not have sexual relations with your kinsman's wife and defile yourself with her. You shall not give any of your offspring to sacrifice them to Moloch, and so profane the name of your Lord, name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. You shall not have sexual relations with any animal and defile yourself with it, nor shall any woman give herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. It is perversion. Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, for by all these practices, the nations I am casting out before you have defiled themselves. Now you notice here the condemnation of a male sleeping with a man is mixed in with a kind of a variety of things, right? That we have other sexual things, that shall not have sexual relations with your kinsman's wife. Probably a good one. You shall not have sex with other beasts. But we also have this, do not kill your offspring by sacrificing them to Moloch in the middle of this, which isn't a sexual thing as far as we're aware of. So what do these things have to do with each other? Why are they being lumped together? Well, there's probably a pretty good chance that we know some of these things, at least, were a part of ritualistic worship in neighboring religions, or other cultic practices. And as I said before, one of the things that gets condemned a lot, we don't want to be like those other religions. We're Israelites. We worship Yahweh, the God of Israel, and we don't want to look like we're worshiping those other gods, or to accidentally do things that do worship those other gods. And so it could be that most or all of these things are a part of other religious practices. And so more than saying this is evil, right, for all time, it could be saying these are things that other people do that we don't want to confuse with what we do. Now, certainly we would still say, yeah, sacrificing our offspring, that's still an evil thing. That's probably evil for all time, right? But some of these others, such as having sex with a woman during her menstrual cycle, is that truly an evil on the same level as sacrificing your children? Or is that maybe, as we mentioned earlier, something that applies to a time, a place, but maybe not universally? And I should point out here, I'm not going to be trying to go through these and prove that they're saying the opposite. I'm not going to share this and say, I think this is actually saying that men should sleep with men, or that homosexuality is absolutely encouraged or something like that. I just want to raise some questions and say, maybe the way we have read these isn't the only way. And so we should be a bit more open to thinking about what these may refer to, especially if we're going to be using these texts to be a universal statement, homosexuality is evil for all time, to look at it within its context and how is it speaking to other things. So I'm, more than anything, I'm just trying to raise some questions and where are there ways that maybe we have not used or understood these texts in correct ways. So if this is involved in cultic worship, specific to that area, then we could say, well, yeah, so it's being condemned, maybe not so much just for the homosexuality, but because it's related to false religious practices or paganistic practices that we don't want to be a part of. And as we said, the writers want to kind of maintain these clear lines. If we're not sure, let's push it out. If there's doubt, we push it out. so that we can maintain a clear sense of purity and not accidentally do things that offend God. So yeah, in this passage, it seems clear the practice condemned. They're part of cultic rituals and other religions. So it's trying to protect the people from worshiping other gods or getting involved in other practices. The other text that we have then, Leviticus 20, all who curse father or mother shall be put to death, having cursed father and mother. Their blood is upon them. If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. The man who lies with his father's wife has uncovered his father's nakedness. Both of them shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. If a man lies with his daughter-in-law, both of them shall be put to death. They have committed perversion. Their blood is upon them. If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. If a man takes a wife and her mother also, it is depravity. They shall be burned to death, both he and they, that there may be no depravity among you. If a man has sexual relations with an animal, he shall be put to death, and you shall kill the animal. If a woman approaches any animal and has sexual relations with it, you shall kill the woman and the animal. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. So here we see a long list of sexual condemnations, right? Most of which, or all of which, we would say, yeah, these are not good. Bestiality, we still think this is inappropriate. Adultery, not good. At the same time, they're cursing father or mother. We might say that's definitely not good, but is it deserving of death? As far as I know, that is not something that we uphold. And I personally think if we were to uphold that seriously, we probably would have no one living past their teenage years in our culture. Or with adultery, certainly we would condemn adultery, but we don't punish it with death, right? In fact, we sometimes admire it within popular culture and stuff like that. Not that I agree with that, but adultery is not something that we say, oh, this is something that a person needs to be put to death. So if we're going to pull out the text that says a man lies with a man as with a woman, they need to be put to death. Well, are we killing the teenagers that talk back to their parents? Or are we killing people that commit adultery? No. So, and how do we understand that within this context? So again, if we look beyond these verses throughout chapter 20, there are more cultic rituals, kind of like in chapter 18. And it ends with, you shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and I have separated you from the other peoples to be mine. So again, there's this idea of, we don't want to be like the neighboring peoples. We don't want to adopt the practices that they have done that we think are inappropriate. So in some sense, the concern seems to be not so much, this is something you should never do for all time, though maybe saying that, as much as these are things that the neighbors you don't want to be like are doing. So let's draw a hard line. When in doubt, push it out. Another important thing to raise with this text, with chapter 20, I think, is the question of consent. It's not terribly clear here if they are talking about consensual sexual relations or if we're talking about rape. Rape has been and continues to be, sadly, a weapon that is used to punish people, to humiliate people. It's a weapon of war. Soldiers will go in and rape people as a way of punishing them, of hurting them, of humiliating them. And so it could be, as we read through this list, is that some of these things that are described, having sex with your stepmother or your kinsman's wife, that may have been a practice of people as not as a romantic affair that they're having, but as a way of getting back at someone. You hurt me, so I'm going to rape your wife. You stole from me, so I'm going to rape your daughter. Things like that, that we would condemn. We would say this isn't right, but it's not describing necessarily two people in a loving relationship as much as one person taking vengeance or using someone. We know that happened in ways that we would describe as same gendered ways that we might describe as homosexual, that there was and there can still be a practice in some Near Eastern cultures where a man may rape another man. That is a form of humiliation, or it's a way of establishing the masculinity of the one doing the raping, but it effeminizes or emasculates the person who is the man who is being raped. And so what may be described here isn't so much a loving relationship between two homosexual men. It may be a rape, or it may be a practice of humiliating or effeminating another man. We don't know for sure, but it's an important question to wrestle with. And if that's the case, then yes, we would still condemn rape. If these things are assuming that these are rape or non-consensual sexual activities, we would still condemn them. Say, yes, that is not appropriate, right? Regardless of the genders of the two people involved, violent, forcible sex is not okay. So, Leviticus and Summary, then, real quick. And here, it's important to look at that thing that I've had on the side. Leviticus, what is the law's purpose? What is it trying to do? What is it trying to teach or shape or create for us? I think it's clear that Levitical law 1 is trying to create a shape of what are God's people like? What do they do? And a lot of that goes back to that definition of sin. It is trying to prevent sin that hurts God and hurts one another. It is trying to prevent ways of living that may have been accepted or common or excused, that God says, no, this is really not what I want. So the verses that condemn abominations includes things that we no longer condemn: eating shrimp or shellfish, right? Abomination may have been a ritual and not a moral distinction. So saying that a man sleeping with a man is an abomination may not be the condemning all-time evil statement that it is sometimes portrayed as. Verses condemning homosexual sex are mixed in with practices from cultic worship. They're connected with other religious practices. Maybe it is condemning a religious practice for other religions that was considered inappropriate. And what was inappropriate about was that it was part of worshiping another god, not so much the homosexual act itself. The sexual acts that are described, they may be rape. They may be a form of shaming. They may be a part of idolatry, and not consensual, loving intercourse between two people. And again, there's no understanding of sexual orientation. So it could also be that two men sleeping with one another, and I should also point out, note, it says nothing about two women having sexual relations. It's only male homosexual relations that are condemned here. That it's not an assumption that these are two men who simply are gay, that's how they are created. They are homosexual men, and this is their natural inclination to be in love with one another. There's no real understanding of that. So it could also be an attempt by the people to correct what they see as a problem within the person, rather than them actually living out who they are created as. So Leviticus has some troubling and uncomfortable language to look at. Again, I will say I don't think Leviticus is arguing for homosexual relationships, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of extenuating circumstances. There's a lot of context and nuance that goes along with these that at least raises questions. If we're going to be reading these passages and using them to condemn or to exclude people, we need to say, what exactly is it referring to? Is it still referring to what we would understand today, and how do we apply it today? So hopefully this raises some questions or something to think about. I always appreciate feedback. You're welcome to share that. And thank you. May the blessings of God's peace and grace go with you and watch you and guide you in all that you do.